striking things about sectarianism anywhere, I think, is you never find any sectarians. Most people assume that what other people call sectarianism is the truth. In other words, we are called sectarian when we make a claim for our view of the world, which other people think is actually only a partial way of looking at the world.
It's the way in which people will reduce it to as Catholics and as Protestants, and if you're neither of those things, well, what do you do with it? Because in part you could say, as some people in the media have done, not in my name, they will say, plague on both their houses, but actually quite often they've locked it into one or t'other. People will look for clues and then decide that they're one of us or one of them.
It's easy to identify, it's easier to identify the big offenders. The people who we all accept are abnormal, we can point to as unacceptable and as extreme. What's much more complicated and much more subtle is actually trying to identify what sectarianism means with it simply being normal.
It was interesting to me that while everybody vaguely knew that it existed, knew that it was a problem, but when you asked them about actual work that had been done, research that had been done, there was a curious silence all over Scotland. There was some historical work, true, so people tend to think about it as this historical thing, but universities, colleges, etc. weren't actually doing current research. But more to the point, you couldn't find any evidence that anybody had actually gone and asked ordinary people about their experiences. So anything that had to do with sectarianism was typically some, a group of high regents would get in a room and have a conversation, but the conversation wouldn't actually extend to the communities.
I have used the cliche a few times about this. What does it matter? The cliche is that it matters when it's about glass bottles. I got it from somebody else, by the way. Glass bottles, which means that it matters when it turns into violence. This stuff has been used for actual reasons. It's been given as a reason, as a rationale, as an excuse for why certain people get thumped and certain people get intimidated and certain people get threatened. It's not the only thing, but it is part, and it does matter in any society about how we manage ourselves. And that spills over, as we know, into a permission for violence which then gets exercised even on people who had nothing to do with the original issue which we started with. So it is about violence in our society and how we deal with it. So that's one aspect of it. Another aspect which is called glass ceilings, glass bottles, glass ceilings. Glass ceilings are, that we use this as an excuse as to why we compare one person for another for giving out stuff. That in the distribution of goods, or the distribution of posts, or the distribution of services, this is somehow matters. And when it's about glass curtains, in other words, that there are ways of going about in this society in which we hide behind the language of difference or the language of history, but in fact it's a kind of an isolation in which people live with a whole set of myths and prejudices which then come out in different types of ways and which are actually not healthy in a plural society and not healthy ways of relating with consequences through generations.
Not all of it's negative though. We had quite a long discussion about the Orange Order. I've been doing quite a bit of research into the Orange Order and some of the positives that they get out of being part of an organisation like that. The conviviality, the sense of family, the sense of tradition, the sense of belonging, etc. It's not all negative, but there are negatives there. It's celebrating difference is good, but we need to celebrate it together. There's no point in celebrating it separately.
A couple of folk in the group were wondering whether the advisory group are veering off towards forgiveness when the situations they're dealing with on the ground are actually still in denial that there is a sectarian issue.
Formal apologies by, for example, governments or churches or whatnot, and we decided that talk is cheap, but dialogue is good. And in a sense, there should be politicians who, I said this, so I'm not putting anyone else in trouble here, politicians should shut up and let people talk to each other, and from there we can start getting towards things.
For forgiveness to be operational, to be meaningful in practice, I think we have to talk about what it is asking of us in real terms.
And we did actually talk about, towards the end of this session, we talked about needing to develop some stages of, say, acknowledgement and acceptance of what has happened, and then moving on so that you don't come at forgiveness head on in a situation. It's almost too much for people.
Also an issue about reciprocation. There's almost a sense in which, no, you apologise first. Right? We will forgive you, but you apologise first. And there is a sort of sense of who wants first.
Desmond Tutu also cautions against equating forgiving and forgetting. And I quote, "In forgiving, people are not asked to forget. On the contrary, it is important to remember so that we should not let such atrocities happen again. Forgiveness does not mean condoning what has been done. It means taking what has happened seriously and not minimizing it, drawing out the sting in the memory that threatens to poison our entire existence.